Hello, it's Veronica, the heart dietitian. Today we are answering the question, can you eat red meat on a heart healthy diet? This is often a question I get when I'm working with individuals one-on-one, but I also offer a monthly membership. It's called the Heart Connection, where people can enroll for a month-to-month membership. You get weekly heart healthy meal plans, access to a community of supported, like-minded individuals, and ask questions like this to me in a forum. Not only that, we have monthly challenges and a workshop, topics determined by you, and they are obviously facilitated by me. So if you haven't heard of it, join the link below. I'd love for you to be there and so that I could support you in the community. So can we eat red meat? Well, let's start off by defining what red meat is. Often my clients think red meat is only beef, but it actually contains more than just beef. Red meat is also considered veal, lamb, mutton, pork, goat, and venison. According to the World Health Organization and the USDA, pork is classified as red meat because of its myoglobin content, even though it's sometimes marketed as the other white meat. It does look white, and that's why it can be marketed that way. But when we look at research studies, pork is grouped in with the red meat. Now, red meat is nutritious. It is a great source of protein. It's also high in nutrients like iron and vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is naturally occurring only in animal products. Now, of course, the quality of red meat depends on a lot of factors. The breed of the animal, the type of the animal, what the animal is fed, either grains or grass, the cut of the meat. So something like sirloin steak has a lot more marbling and saturated fat compared to a tenderloin, for example. And also the way that you cook it would alter the nutritional content of the red meat itself. When we look to the guidelines, so the American Heart Association guidelines, the Canadian Cardiovascular Society, they don't necessarily call out red meat and define the amount of red meat that is acceptable in a heart healthy diet. What they do suggest is some dietary patterns that have been researched really well for long periods of time with many individuals to prevent a cardiac event or a secondary cardiac event. So I'm thinking something like the Mediterranean diet, for example. In the Mediterranean diet, it's a pyramid. So the foods at the bottom of the pyramid you want to consume more of, and then when you get up to the top of the pyramid, you want to consume less of. Well, when we look at where red meat is positioned there, red meat is at the very top of the Mediterranean diet. They suggest limiting red meat to a few times a month and choosing leaner proteins such as chicken, turkey, and fish more often. The other important feature of the Mediterranean diet is that it emphasizes a lot of plant foods, including plant protein. So when you look at the bottom of the pyramid, they do include beans and legumes there, which is something that they consume on a daily basis. I mention that because it's not just about how many times a day or a week you should be having red meat, but you should also be prioritizing these heart healthy foods such as plant proteins and more plant foods that have shown the benefits of lowering our cholesterol, adding healthy nutrients to our diet like soluble fiber and micronutrients like potassium, magnesium, calcium, for example. And then we need to look at the research. So there was a fairly recent meta-analysis in 2023 that concluded that unprocessed and processed red meat consumption are both associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And when we just look at unprocessed red meat consumption, it increases your risk of stroke and heart failure. So why is that the case? So we can look at red meat and the amount of saturated fat found in red meat. The amount of saturated fat is something that is encouraged to limit according to the American Heart Association. And we want to limit saturated fat to no more than 6% of your total calories. So for example, someone who's consuming a 2,000 calorie diet, that would be consuming no more than 13 grams of saturated fat a day. But I think it goes beyond just the saturated fat content. When we look at dietary guidelines as a whole, they also restrict red meat consumption. So that's dietary guidelines for whole populations and not just someone who's living with heart disease. So you can look at the US dietary guidelines as well as European guidelines, and they both recommend reducing red meat consumption so that you can reduce your risk of chronic conditions like cardiovascular disease. We can also look to other dietary patterns that are recommended by the American Heart Association. So not only the Mediterranean diet, but we can look at the DASH diet. So that's a diet designed to lower your blood pressure, the portfolio diet, and the vegan or vegetarian diet. Those are all recommended dietary patterns that can help prevent cardiovascular disease or prevent cardiovascular events. So when we look at the vegan or vegetarian diet, that is a plant-based diet and they don't have any red meat consumption in their intake. Then we can look at the portfolio diet, which is a plant-based diet, but there has been some research to include some animal products as long as you're following the other principles of the portfolio diet, which is mainly plant-based. Still no recommendation of how many times a week you can consume red meat. Then we can look at the DASH diet. So that's the diet designed to lower your blood pressure. It's an acronym, actually. It stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. And it does recommend lean meat, and red meat can be considered in that weekly. So I think the most important thing there is lean meat. So again, limiting the amount of fat, specifically the saturated fat found in the red meat. And so when I present this information to my clients, they say, Veronica, I still want a number. Tell me how much I can consume. And it's really not that easy because the guidelines don't really have a safe amount that you can consume. So I always throw it back to say, how much red meat can you consume that will still bring you joy, but is limited. So you have to find that balance. So what is that for you? And then when I have done a little bit more research, there is the Heart Foundation of New Zealand. It does have a great article, which I can link below, and it does actually provide some amounts of red meat that you can consume in a week. So what they recommend is aiming for less than 350 grams of red meat a week. And the key message there is 350 grams or less per week, or less is important because, it's not saying that you can have 350 grams every week. It's saying how limit it to 350 grams, or if you can consume less, that's great too. So what does the 350 grams or 12 ounces look like? Well, it's actually 3 deck of cards. So it's the surface area of the deck of cards, but also the thickness when you compare it to your red meat portion. And the Heart Foundation of New Zealand goes a little bit further, and they suggest actually making sure that you're only consuming a maximum of 100 grams of red meat per serving or per time you're eating the red meat. So you don't want to have all 12 ounces at one time, splitting it up into these 100 grams or 3.5 ounces. So that's that one deck of cards, for example, would be more manageable for your body to process and digest. And then, of course, the quality of the red meat is really important to consider as well. So we want to be consuming a lean cut of red meat when possible. And then you can also consider the breed of the animal, the type of feed of the animal, and so forth for quality. So because you may be consuming less red meat now that you're diagnosed with heart disease, perhaps take that money that you were spending on your red meat and move it to a smaller amount of red meat, but higher quality. And I think your body would thank you for that. And then, of course, cooking methods do impact the red meat consumption as well. So we don't want to be cooking at high heat or oven cooking, dry cooking, or frying. The best type of cooking for red meat is actually like a moist cooking. So like boiling, like a slow cooker, for example, would be great. And that would be a healthy way to preserve the nutrient content, particularly the water-soluble vitamins that are found in the red meat, such as the vitamin B12. And then the lower temperatures that you can cook at don't expose the red meat to those direct flames, because that open flame can cause charring or blackening of the meat, which can expose you to HCAs or PAH, if I got that right. And they are associated with several cancers such as colorectal and pancreatic. So what are my final thoughts? Can you eat red meat on a heart healthy diet? Sure. Does everyone have to? No. And kind of assessing what you're doing now. Is it around the 350 grams? If it is, then maybe perhaps cutting down a little bit, right? That guideline from the Heart Foundation of New Zealand said 350 grams a week or less. So is it possible to reduce it and replace it with some heart healthy proteins that we know do provide a strengthening component for our heart, such as those plant-based proteins like beans and legumes? Remember, they offer that soluble fiber that can help lower our cholesterol levels. Or perhaps is it fish that you want to replace the red meat with? Because we know that eating 2 servings of fatty fish like salmon and trout and mackerel, sardines, they are rich in those omega-3 fatty acids, which are essential. And making sure we're consuming them through food is really important because our body can't make that on its own. So perhaps it's prioritizing those, and as a result, you're reducing your red meat consumption as well. But knowing that you don't have to eliminate it can provide some relief, and I know it has to some of my clients, but I think it's more about what does your whole diet look like? Are you in, and we can go back to something like the Mediterranean diet and looking at the dietary pyramid there. Remember, the majority of the food that is recommended and consumed, not only in the Mediterranean, but the DASH diet, as well as the portfolio diet and the vegan and vegetarian diet, are plant foods. So thinking and assessing your current diet, and are you consuming those plant foods, your vegetables, your fruit, your plant-based proteins, nuts and seeds, olive oil, for example, lots of heart healthy nutrients there that can help strengthen your heart. And I think putting emphasis on are you including these can help you reduce your red meat intake without focusing on that as a reduction or a limitation of the heart healthy diet. So it's a little bit of a reframe. When we focus on adding all these foods, it just has less room for the red meat that has been associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So I hope in general that helps you out, gives you some kind of a number that a lot of my clients like. But again, the number is not defined. It's not something that is in a lot of the guidelines. And I think as little as you can eat, that you can still enjoy and keep that heart healthy diet sustainable, something that you can continue to consume every day for the rest of your life is really, really important. So if that helps, let me know in the comments below, or let me know what your questions are. I'd love to hear from you and answer them in the next video. So before I sign off, I just wanted to highlight my 7-day free heart healthy menu that you can, or meal plan that you can subscribe to my weekly email list. And you'll be getting a lot of heart healthy tips, as well as this eating plan with recipes and a grocery list to help jumpstart your heart healthy diet. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time.